before you decide to stay. Understand this. What I'm about to tell you was never meant to reach your ears. Not because it's fiction, but because once you hear it, you will never be able to unsee the patterns in your own life. There was a girl once. No one remembers her name, and that's intentional. She didn't live in a normal house, and she didn't live in a normal world. She lived beneath it, in a basement that was never listed on blueprints, never recorded on city plans, and never acknowledged by the people who owned the building above. She wasn't locked there. That's the part that should disturb you. She stayed because she was placed there for a purpose. She could tell you what you'd done in the dark. Not the obvious things. Not the loud mistakes. The silent ones. The ones you buried so deeply you convinced yourself they never happened. Men would come down the stairs laughing, confident, arrogant, and they'd leave unable to meet their own reflection, because she would whisper truths that were surgically precise. She didn't guess. She didn't accuse. She described. What makes this story dangerous isn't that it's dark. It's that it's real in the way real power always is. Hidden, quiet, denied. She wasn't a psychic. She wasn't a mystic. She was a product of a system designed to study men when they believed they were alone, when they believed no one was watching. She was trained to see micro-expressions, breathing shifts, eye flickers, hand tension. And from that, she could reconstruct your secret self. This is not a horror story. This is a story about the architecture of control. Because what they were building in that basement wasn't just a girl who could read men. They were building a weapon, a living archive of human weakness, a breathing library of shame, fear, desire, and corruption. And they didn't build her to destroy men. They built her to guide them, or manipulate them, or blackmail them, depending on the need. And the worst part, you don't need to be in a basement to be studied like this anymore. You're being read right now. The way your eyes move across these words, the pause between sentences, the tension in your jaw. This is where the descent begins. And once you step forward, there is no clean way back. The men who created her never spoke her name out loud. Not because they were afraid of her, but because speaking her name made her real. And reality was the one thing they couldn't afford to acknowledge. On paper, the project never existed. Funding moved through shell foundations, medical fronts, and psychological research grants with titles so boring no one would ever look twice. They called it behavioral mapping. In truth, it was the first serious attempt to weaponize truth. They didn't kidnap her. That part matters. No chains. No van. No dramatic rescue story. They found her because she was already invisible. A child who slipped through the cracks of institutions, records, families, and expectations. A child no one would look for. No missing posters. No grieving headlines. The perfect subject. Not because she was weak, but because she had no echo in the world above. They brought her into a concrete room with no windows and no clocks. They didn't torture her body. They shaped her mind. Hour by hour, they fed her voices. Men confessing things they'd never told their wives. Their pastors. Their friends. Recordings of broken generals. Whispered admissions of judges. Crooked smiles of men who sat on boards and pulpits and thrones. They trained her ear before they trained her eyes. She learned the sound of a lie before she learned the rhythm of truth. Over time, they brought in living men. Powerful men. Men who thought they were there to evaluate her subject. Men who thought they were doing the observing. She never spoke first. She let silence stretch. She let their ego fill the air. She watched hands, shoulders, mouth corners, the way their breath changed when certain words were spoken. Fear has a sound. Pride has a rhythm. Guilt has a temperature. She became something unnatural to them. Not in a monstrous way. In a precise way. A surgical way. She didn't hate them. She catalogued them. She organized their darkness. She learned that every man, no matter how controlled, has a fracture point. A memory. A desire. A shame. Something that, once touched, makes the mask fall away in slow motion. This wasn't about cruelty. It was about leverage. Power doesn't come from fists. It comes from knowing where the soul is weakest. That basement wasn't a prison. It was a laboratory for building a quiet God. And gods, real ones, don't scream. They whisper. By the time she turned 16, the basement no longer felt like a room. It felt like a throat. A narrow place designed for secrets to slide downward and never return. She had listened to so many confessions that her mind began to organize them into patterns. Not random darkness, structured darkness. Systems, rituals, repeated behaviors that powerful men shared without ever meeting each other. Different faces, same sins, different cities, same corruption. That's when she realized something that changed everything. The men weren't as unique as they believed. She started predicting them before they arrived. She could feel what kind of man was walking down the stairs just by the weight of his footsteps. Heavy heel strikes meant arrogance. Hesitant steps meant someone who had already been cracked by his own conscience. Smooth, confident rhythm meant a liar who believed his own performance. They never understood how she knew. They thought they were studying her. In reality, she was dissecting them. Her words became more precise, more surgical. She could look at a man and say, quietly, "You were 10 years old when you learned that love could be taken, not given." And watch his face collapse in silence. She could whisper, "You don't fear being exposed. You fear being ordinary." And watch a billionaire's hands tremble. But what makes this story dangerous isn't her ability. It's what she discovered about the structure above her. The building she was in wasn't random. It was part of a network. One basement, one node, one listening chamber in a larger web designed to map the psychological architecture of male power. Universities, think tanks, intelligence programs, leadership institutes. Different names, same objective. Understand the male psyche deeply enough to guide it, shape it, steer it. Not by force, by illusion of choice. That's when she understood her real role. She wasn't just reading men. She was training the future of control. She started slipping truths into the spaces between their thoughts. She would leave men with ideas they thought were their own, doubts they believed were natural, desires they couldn't trace back to her. Psychological seeds planted in the soft soil of ego and fear. This wasn't mind control. It was something more terrifying. Direction without visibility. And the worst part, it worked. Men left that basement feeling enlightened, empowered, awakened. They thought they gained insight. In reality, they'd been slightly adjusted, like a compass magnet nudged just enough to alter their destination by miles. This is how real power works. And you, without realizing it, have felt this before. That sudden idea that didn't feel like it came from you. That impulse that felt strangely natural. That decision that just made sense in the moment. She was the prototype, and you are living in the finished version. There was a rule in that basement that was never written down. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it in their bones. She was never to be believed. Not officially. Not on record. Not in reports. They could use her insights. They could exploit her precision. They could let her shape outcomes. But they were never allowed to admit that a girl sitting under concrete and wires understood them better than they understood themselves. Power structures cannot tolerate mirrors, especially ones that don't flinch. So they did what institutions always do when confronted with something they can't control completely. They wrapped her in doubt. They labeled her unstable in documents. Overactive imagination. Prone to symbolic thinking. They built a paper prison around her, so that if she ever spoke above ground, no one would take her seriously. But she knew. She always knew. And that knowledge began to rot inside her in a very specific way. Not like madness. Not like rage. Like clarity with nowhere to go. She started to see how rituals of power repeated themselves. Not in robes and candles, but in boardrooms, courtrooms, military briefings. The rituals of dominance. The silent rules. The invisible hierarchies. Men didn't rise because they were strong. They rose because they were predictable in the right ways. That's when she began to understand what the basement really was. It wasn't just for reading men. It was for designing the ideal man. Not morally, structurally. A man easy to motivate, easy to redirect, easy to control through pride instead of chains. They weren't building slaves. They were building self-policing soldiers of systems they didn't even see. She started to test her boundaries. Instead of just observing, she began to subtly alter the outcomes. A man who came in cruel, she made cautious. A man who came in ambitious, she injected with paranoia. A man who came in loyal, she quietly fractured. She didn't do this out of evil. She did it to prove something to herself. That even from a basement, she could move the world. That even from beneath the system, She could touch its crown. And she was right. Months passed. Then years. And strange things began happening above ground. Promotions that made no sense. Rivalries that felt artificial. Leaders who suddenly changed direction without explanation. They didn't realize what was happening. She was no longer just a reader. She was a ghost in their bloodstream. A shadow architect. And if you think this is about her, you're missing the real danger. Because the system learned from her. They watched what she did. They studied how she influenced without being seen. And they replicated it. In media. In advertising. In education. In religion. What they learned in that basement didn't stay in that basement. It became the world you live in. And most men never feel the strings. They just call it life. She stopped keeping track of time long before she stopped caring. In a place where the lights never change and the air never shifts, time becomes a myth, a story told by people who live above ground. What replaced it was a different kind of awareness, constant, tight pressure in the chest, like standing at the edge of a cliff that never lets you fall. Her mind grew sharper, colder, quieter. She no longer reacted to men. She measured them. She didn't feel their words. She weighed them. The most frightening thing she learned wasn't how easy it was to expose them. It was how badly they wanted to be exposed. Powerful men live surrounded by silence. Not peaceful silence. Rutting silence. The kind that eats through the brain slowly. They came to her pretending to evaluate her. But they came starving. Starving to be seen. To be understood. To have someone touch the part of them that had gone numb from too much control. She became their confessional without religion. Their mirror without mercy. They would sit in front of her and feel their masks cracking. Not because she attacked them, but because she saw them too clearly. And clarity, when you're built on lies, feels like pain. Behind the walls, technicians listened. Not to protect her. To harvest her. Every word she spoke was recorded, analyzed, stripped apart by men in clean offices who would never sit in that chair. They weren't interested in her humanity, only her effectiveness. She wasn't a person to them. She was a function, a tool refined by silence and isolation. But tools can learn, and that is what they never planned for. She started listening not just to the men, but to the pauses in the control room microphones. Tiny clicks, tiny feedback loops, the breath of someone trying not to breathe too loudly. She trained her hearing beyond what they thought possible. She could feel when someone flinched behind the wall. She could sense when her words landed too close to the truth upstairs. That's when the fear started. Not in her. In them. Because she wasn't just reading the subjects anymore. She was reading the watchers. And when the watchers realize they are seen, the entire structure trembles. They began to test her limits without telling her. Feeding her false subjects. Actors. Controlled personalities designed to confuse her, to see if her instincts were built on intuition or training. Men with rehearsed traumas. Scripted guilt. Manufactured darkness. They wanted to know if she was truly dangerous, or just a clever parrot reflecting what she had been given. She dismantled them in minutes. Not by exposing their acting, but by exposing what was underneath the act. Because even fake men are real men trying to hide from themselves. She looked at them and said things that weren't in any script. Things that made their stomachs drop. Things that made the control room go silent. That was when they stopped trying to control her and started trying to contain her. Her sessions were shortened, then limited, then delayed. They began to rotate staff, hoping to break whatever connection she was forming with the structure itself. But systems that fear their own creation always make the same mistake. They act too late. By that time, she had already mapped the emotional architecture of the building. She knew who hated their job, who feared her, who respected her, who saw her as a myth. Power isn't just about who commands, it's about who trembles, and why. She stopped viewing herself as a prisoner. She started viewing herself as a test. If she could shift men from a chair in a silent room, what could she shift once she was free? And that thought became the most dangerous thing in that basement. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she wanted proof. Proof that knowledge was stronger than position. That insight was sharper than authority. That a mind trained in darkness could outmaneuver men raised in light. She began to test the edges of reality. Long silences. Sudden eye contact. Speaking less, but meaning more. Men began to leave her room changed in unpredictable ways. Not guided. Not nudged. Unstable. The system doesn't fear rebellion. It fears chaos. Because rebellion can be studied. Chaos cannot. So they started writing the final stage of her existence. They just didn't tell her. And she could feel it. Like pressure behind the eyes. Like a room slowly filling with invisible water. The kind of ending that doesn't announce itself. It just tightens. The day they decided she was too dangerous, nothing changed on the surface. No alarms. No shouting. No dramatic footsteps. Just a subtle shift in the air that only someone like her could feel. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful but surgical. Like a room where a decision has already been made. The lights felt colder. The walls felt closer. Even the silence had a different texture. Like it was holding its breath. They brought her a man she had never seen in her patterns before. He walked differently. Sat differently. Breathed differently. Not powerful in the usual way. Not arrogant. Not trembling. He looked at her like he was looking at himself in a mirror that hurt to face. And she understood immediately. He wasn't there to be studied. He was there to measure her. He asked her simple questions. What do you think this place is? What do you think your purpose is? What do you think happens when a tool becomes aware of its own design? She answered calmly, not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear gives power to the wrong people. She said the words carefully. She said the truth sideways. Because the truth, when spoken directly, gets you erased. When he left, the air changed again. That night, alone in the room with no clock and no window, she realized something that settled into her bones with terrifying clarity. They weren't planning to kill her. They were planning to bury her deeper. Above her, they were building new floors, new offices, new layers, turning the original basement into a myth even within their own structure, hiding her, not from the world, but from history, so no one would ever trace what came next back to her. But what they didn't understand is this. You can't bury an idea that has already outgrown its origin. She stopped thinking about escape. She started thinking about infection. If she couldn't leave, she would spread. Not physically, mentally, invisibly. She began altering her words in microscopic ways. Changing inflection, changing timing, using certain phrases that triggered subconscious reactions. Men would leave her room carrying something they didn't arrive with. A tension, a question, a fracture line that would open weeks later. She wasn't fighting the system head-on. She was hollowing it out from the inside. Slowly, patiently, silently. And that's when the most dangerous truth emerged. She no longer belonged to the basement. The basement belonged to her. Because power isn't about the room you're trapped in. It's about the mind you leave changed after you speak years passed in that unnatural place. But she aged in a way that had nothing to do with time. Her eyes became still. Not empty. Still. Like deep water that doesn't ripple when stones are thrown. The scientists thought she was becoming dormant. Less reactive. Less expressive. They mistook control for decay. That mistake would echo. She had stopped trying to scare men. Stopped trying to crack them open. That phase was primitive. Emotional. Inefficient. She moved into something colder. She began teaching without appearing to teach. She let men talk themselves into cages made of their own logic. She guided them to conclusions that weakened their own foundations, while they believed they were becoming stronger. This is the secret architecture of modern power. No chains. No threats. Just carefully guided thoughts that feel like freedom. She learned the difference between a man who is controlled and a man who is aligned. Controlled men break. Aligned men self-correct. The system doesn't want slaves. It wants loyal soldiers who think they chose their battlefield. She helped design that. Her sessions became famous in places she never saw. Silent rooms where men in suits watched recordings of her face. Slowed them down. Measured her pauses. Studied her breathing. They called it behavioral oracle modeling. She called it something else. Harvest. She saw their future before they did. A world where basements weren't needed anymore. Where the girl wasn't necessary. Because the system would live inside screens. Inside voices. Inside carefully shaped narratives that would reach millions without a single locked door. And that's when a new emotion touched her for the first time. Not fear. Not anger. Grief. Because she realized something that hurts more than any prison. They weren't afraid of her because she was dangerous. They were afraid of her because she was obsolete. They had learned enough. They had extracted her. And now, she was a liability. You can feel it when a system decides you are no longer useful. It becomes gentle, polite, clinical. They don't hurt you. They archive you. She could feel the archive closing around her, like a slow, soft coffin made of professionalism and protocol. And she knew the next door that opened wouldn't be another interview. It would be the last one she'd ever walk through. The last room didn't look like an ending. That's how real endings work. No drama. No warning. Just a space that feels slightly too clean, slightly too quiet, slightly too polite. She could tell it wasn't designed for questions. It was designed for closure. The kind of place where systems come to erase loose ends and call it efficiency. She sat down without being asked. She didn't resist. Resistance would have meant they still saw her as alive. What they didn't understand is that she had already moved past survival. They spoke softly to her, smiled carefully, used words like completion and containment and ethical responsibility. The language of men who cannot admit they are afraid. She watched their mouths instead of their eyes. Mouths reveal the real emotion. Eyes are trained. Their lips tightened when she looked directly at them. Microfey. Unmistakable. They told her she had served her purpose, that she had helped advance understanding, that the world was safer because of her. They framed her life like a successful project report. She almost found it funny. Not because it was absurd, but because it was accurate. She had been a project, a tool, a key they used until the door was open wide enough. But here's what they never accounted for. A key, once it understands the shape of the lock, can open doors on its own. Her voice was calm when she spoke, calm enough to make them uneasy. She didn't beg. She didn't threaten. She simply asked them a question that felt like a hand closing around their throats. Do you think I'm the only one? Silence is dangerous in rooms like that, because silence means imagination. And imagination is where fear lives. They exchanged looks. Very fast. Very small. But she saw them. She always did. And she knew the truth before they said it. There were others. Other basements. Other girls. Other experiments. And suddenly, her story stopped being about isolation. It became about a network. She wasn't the monster. She was the prototype. And prototypes don't get destroyed. They get replicated. She walked out of that room alive. That surprised them. It surprised her too. But life, she realized, doesn't always mean freedom. Sometimes it just means relocation. They didn't release her. They reassigned her. Somewhere else. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere even harder to find. Her body left the basement. But the basement had already entered the world. The new place didn't have concrete walls. It had white ones. Smooth ones. The kind designed to look humane. The kind that convinces you this isn't a prison. This is care. But she could feel the difference immediately. This wasn't containment. This was storage. She had been moved like a classified file that still held value, but not urgency. Placed somewhere safe from questions. Safe from historians. Safe from anyone who might connect the past to the present. She was given a small room. A window that didn't open. A clock that worked. A bed that felt softer than it deserved to. Comfort is more dangerous than cruelty. Cruelty makes you fight. Comfort makes you forget. And the system prefers forgetfulness. They stopped bringing men to her. That was the cruelest part. Silence without purpose is a slow erasure. She found herself remembering faces. Remembering the way fear tasted in the air when a man's mask fell off. Remembering the way power looked when it realized it was being studied. She missed the work. That scared her more than anything. She missed being the blade. So she made her own work. She started listening to the building. Ventilation systems. Elevator rhythms. The footsteps of nurses. The late-night conversations of guards who thought no one could hear through walls like these. She began mapping again. People are systems. Buildings are systems. Nothing escaped structure. And slowly, a new truth took shape inside her. The world didn't move forward. It rotated. The same men. The same fears. The same corruption. Different decades. Different faces. Same architecture of control. That's when she realized something that hit deeper than fear. Deeper than anger. She wasn't archived. She was being preserved. Not for what she had done, but for what was coming. They were afraid to let her die. Because when systems get shaky, they go back to their oldest weapons. And she was ancient. She began to speak less out loud, and more in her mind, practicing influence without voice, practicing the art of presence, because presence is what changes rooms, not words. When someone walks in and the air shifts, that's not magic. That's training. Years passed, then decades. Her body aged slowly, strangely, like it had been tuned instead of worn. And deep inside, she felt something approaching, a familiar pressure, a familiar silence, the sound of men remembering they built something they could never fully control. The door would open again, not to study her, but to ask for her. When the door finally opened, it didn't sound like hope. It sounded like desperation trying to walk quietly. The footsteps were faster, heavier, not the slow, confident rhythm of men in control. These were men moving like something was chasing them. And in a way, it was. They sat in front of her like they used to, but their eyes had changed. Less arrogance, more fracture, more fear leaking through polished expressions. They didn't pretend this time. They needed her. The world above had become too chaotic, too loud, too unstable. The systems she once helped design were glitching. Men weren't behaving according to the old maps. The quiet influence wasn't sticking like it used to. Something was breaking the rhythm. Something was waking men up in the wrong way. Without control. Without guidance. Unpredictable. And unpredictability terrifies architects of power. They asked her to help them understand it. To decode what was going wrong. To help stabilize what was falling apart. They spoke like this was a favor. Like this was collaboration. Like she hadn't been buried for years while they used her work like a blueprint. She listened. She didn't refuse. She smiled. Not out of kindness. Out of strategy. She had waited a lifetime for this moment. They thought they were reactivating a tool. In reality, they were handing a weapon a new battlefield. She began speaking again. Slowly. Carefully. With intention. She explained how men were changing. How the old psychological cages weren't strong enough anymore. How the modern mind had too much information, too much access, too much chaos to be controlled by simple pride and fear. She told them something they didn't want to hear. You can't fully control a man who has already seen behind the curtain. You can only redirect him. They leaned in. They were hooked. They were learning. They were vulnerable. And vulnerability is where real influence lies. She started slipping in new frameworks. New stabilization concepts. New containment strategies. But these weren't for the world. They were for the men in the room. She was no longer infecting their subjects. She was infecting the architects themselves. And this time, she wasn't doing it out of curiosity. She was doing it out of precision. She had mapped these men faster than any before them. Fearful power is sloppy power. And they were terrified. Of exposure. Of collapse. Of losing their invisible hands on the wheel of society. She became their advisor. Their oracle. Their last resort. And the irony was almost poetic. They had buried her to keep her silent. Now they were begging her to speak. And every word she gave them moved the knife deeper. Section 12. They started building their war room around her without realizing it. Chairs shifted. Screens tilted toward her. Conversations paused until she spoke. The girl from the basement had become the quiet center of men who once thought they were gods. No one questioned how it happened. No one dared. Authority loves to pretend it chose its own direction, even when it is being led by someone it once tried to erase. She studied them like she used to study the visitors in the basement, only now the stakes were higher. These weren't men confessing in fear. These were men shaping narratives, economies, digital shadows that reached into the homes and minds of millions. And their fear tasted different. It wasn't shame. It was loss of grip. Slippery control. Fingertips barely touching the wheel of a machine they no longer understood. She told them stories that weren't really stories. She framed modern chaos as something external, something hostile. She gave them a target. A phantom enemy. Men sleep better when they believe the loss of power is caused by something outside themselves. They need to feel hunted instead of exposed. She knew this instinct from the moment she first learned to read their breathing. And slowly, subtly, she started to shift their definitions of strength. She described men who ruled not by force, but by silence. Not by visibility, but by presence. Not by shouting, but by being unavoidable. She planted the idea that true power wasn't loud systems, but invisible architecture. Frameworks so subtle that even the architects forget who designed them. They began to repeat her words in their own meetings. Her phrases leaked into policy drafts. Her philosophy showed up in strategies they believed they invented. That was always her gift. Influence without fingerprints. But inside, something darker grew. She wasn't guiding them back to stability. She was guiding them toward dependence. Every question they asked her made them weaker. Every answer she gave made her stronger. She could see it in their faces. The shift from suspicion to trust. From authority to reliance. They were no longer leaders. They were clients. Addicts of her clarity. And clarity, when controlled, becomes a leash. She began to withhold answers on purpose. Letting them feel lost. Letting them panic. Letting them return to her like children returning to a lighthouse in fog. This was never about revenge. Revenge is emotional. This was about symmetry, balance, correction of a story that had been written wrong from the beginning. They created the perfect monster, then tried to lock her away. Now, the monster was writing the rules. And the most disturbing part, they still thought they were in control. This is how real shifts in power happen. No coups. No gunfire. No headlines. Just one quiet mind slowly stepping into the center while everyone else backs away without realizing why. There comes a moment in every system where the architects begin to forget they are building anything at all. They start to believe the structure is natural, eternal, self-sustaining. That's when they are most vulnerable. She could see that moment approaching like a crack spreading through glass. Their reliance on her had turned into ritual. Meetings didn't start until she spoke. Decisions didn't feel real until she validated them with a quiet sentence. She had become their conscience, their compass, their ghost. And ghosts don't ask permission. She began suggesting changes so subtle they felt harmless. A word adjusted in a document. A tone shifted in a speech. A concept framed with a slightly different moral angle. To them, it felt like optimization. To her, it felt like moving furniture in a room that had once been locked. She watched as men who once dismissed her existence now mirrored her cadence, copied the way she paused before speaking, borrowed her phrasing when they wanted to sound deep. Power likes to imitate what it cannot fully understand. Inside her, there was no triumph, only precision, because this was never personal. This was structural. She wasn't fighting men. She was rewiring the machine that made them. That's when she started to introduce the idea of controlled awakening. Not too fast. Not too deep. Just enough to make certain men feel chosen. Not slaves. Not sheep. But select. Elevated. Away. Men love to feel like they've been invited behind a curtain. They'll defend the illusion even when the stage is burning. She proposed systems that didn't feel like control. They felt like initiation. Brotherhood. Knowledge. Hierarchy hidden as mentorship. And they loved it. Because it sounded like strength. And it felt like purpose. They thought they were rising. They never noticed they were being positioned. This is where the story bends. Because halfway through her plan, she understood something that almost broke her discipline. She wasn't just manipulating them. She was enjoying it. Not in a petty way. In a calm, fulfilled way. Like someone finally using the tool they were built to be. And somewhere deep, in a place that still remembered concrete walls and hidden microphones, she realized the most terrifying truth of all. The basement didn't make her this way. It revealed what was always there. She wasn't created. She was uncovered. And men were never her enemy. They were her medium, her language, her instrument. The shift became irreversible the moment they stopped questioning her and started defending her. That's when influence becomes ownership. A man who defends you without being asked is no longer thinking freely. He's protecting a version of himself that exists because of you. She watched it happen in real time. The subtle aggression in their voices when someone suggested alternatives. The tightness in their jaws when others tried to step around her presence. She had become necessary. And necessity is the strongest chain of all. She began to work like a quiet virus. Not destroying, not collapsing, integrating. Attaching herself to the core logic of their structures. The way decisions were framed. The order in which options were presented. The emotional tone that guided every final call. She didn't need authority. She had gravity. This is the kind of power that doesn't announce itself. It settles. It sinks in. It becomes unquestioned. And that's when she prepared the midpoint ritual. Every descent needs a marker, a psychological threshold, a moment where the listener no longer feels like a spectator, but like part of the architecture of the story. She knew that power isn't complete until it recruits awareness. So I'm going to do something now that feels small, but isn't. Wherever you are, reading this, watching this, listening to this, you're no longer outside the story. You've stepped far enough in. And if you want to understand the rest, if you want to stay awake inside this instead of just observing it, you need to lock your identity into the descent. In the comments, I want you to write this exact phrase. I see the root. Write it twice. Not once. Twice. This isn't superstition. This isn't symbolism for show. This is psychological positioning. When you write it, your mind stops treating this like entertainment and starts treating it like participation. You stop being a viewer and become a witness. Go ahead. Type it. I see the root. I see the root, because from this point forward, the story stops being about her and starts being about you. From here on, you're not watching a descent. You're in it. Once the threshold was crossed, there was no more pretending this was just a story. That was the real function of the ritual, not to control, but to reveal. Because a man who willingly types a phrase that feels forbidden has already crossed an invisible line. He has proven something to himself without anyone needing to say it out loud. That's how transformation actually works. Quiet, voluntary, permanent. She understood that better than anyone. After the awakening architecture was put in place, she noticed something that disturbed even her. The men around her weren't just following her guidance. They were changing internally. Their fear wasn't fading. It was being refined. Their aggression wasn't disappearing. It was becoming ceremonial. More controlled. More focused. Less chaotic. They started carrying themselves like men who felt chosen by something they couldn't explain. And that was the danger. Because when men feel chosen, they don't ask who chose them. They just obey the feeling. She had turned institutions into temples without ever building a single altar. She had converted control into calling, manipulation into mentorship, obedience into identity. And the machine ran smoother because of it. But she saw the flaw immediately. A system based on illusion eventually creates men who notice patterns. Not all of them, but enough. There were quiet outliers. Men who didn't lean forward when she spoke. Men who didn't feel honored. Men who felt watchful. They observed the structure instead of worshiping it. They didn't resist. They didn't expose. They simply learned. Those men reminded her of herself. And that made them dangerous. She realized something then that had never occurred to her in the basement. Real power doesn't fear rebellion. It fears succession. It fears the student who doesn't copy, but evolves. And she was surrounded by future versions of herself, men who didn't want to be ruled, even by invisible hands. Men who wanted to understand the machine, not serve it. That's when a new emotion surfaced. Not fear. Respect. Because the descent wasn't one-directional anymore. It was branching. She had created thinkers, not puppets. And thinkers don't stay inside frames forever. The system started to wobble in a new way. Not loudly. Not publicly. Quiet internal stress fractures. Conflicting philosophies. Subtle ideological tension. The kind that doesn't explode. It erodes. She could feel the next phase coming. Not collapse. Not rebellion. But mutation. The most dangerous stage of any hidden structure. Because once it mutates, no one controls it. Not even her. The first time she realized she no longer controlled the direction, it felt strangely calm. No panic. No shock. Just a quiet recognition. Like noticing the tide has shifted while you were standing in the water. The men she had shaped began shaping each other. Her language started evolving in their mouths. Her ideas twisted, sharpened, distorted into forms she never explicitly designed. This is what happens when influence becomes culture. You can't turn it off. You can't recall it. You can't erase it. It lives. It grows. And it stops asking permission. She had created a living system. A thought organism that spread from mind to mind. Not a conspiracy. Not a cult. Something far more dangerous. A framework that feels natural once it enters you. Men started adopting its logic without knowing where it came from. They couldn't point to a source. They just felt aligned. And alignment is addictive. She watched from the center as her influence became invisible even to herself. The machine learned how to run without her constant touch. That's when she understood the paradox of real power. If it still needs you, it isn't complete. And her creation was nearing completion. But something else was happening. She was changing. Not becoming weaker. Becoming quieter. Like a knife that no longer needs to be lifted to be felt. She started stepping back in meetings. Speaking less. Letting them operate. Letting them test themselves. Not because she was losing relevance, but because she was preparing something deeper. You don't stay visible when you want to shape the future. You dissipate. She began to think about what comes after architecture. After manipulation. After influence. Something more ancient. Something closer to myth. Not a position. Not a role. A symbol. She realized she didn't need to be in the room anymore. Her shadow was enough. She began the slow retreat. Reducing her presence. Shortening her statements. Letting ambiguity replace clarity. Men grew uncomfortable again. Good. Discomfort creates introspection. Introspection creates dependence. Dependence creates legend. And legends don't age. Somewhere in her mind, a memory safest. Cold concrete. No windows. No clock. Just a girl learning to hear lies and breathing. And she smiled. Because that girl hadn't been lost. She had multiplied. When she finally stepped out of the rooms where decisions were made, no one announced it. There was no farewell. No ceremony. No one dares to ritualize the disappearance of something they can't afford to admit existed. They simply felt it. A subtle absence. A silence that had weight to it. Like the hum of a machine suddenly gone quiet, making everyone aware of how much they depended on the sound. They kept using her language. They kept following her structures. They kept walking inside the invisible paths she carved. And that was the point. She no longer needed to be seen because the system now thought in her patterns. She had moved from operator to architecture. From voice to foundation. From presence to pressure. Above ground, the world went on. Politics. Wars. Markets. Media storms. No one mentioned the girl. No one ever would. But something had shifted in the air of power. Men started feeling watched in new ways. Not by cameras. Not by God. But by awareness. A quiet suspicion that their thoughts were no longer entirely private. That their motives were being mapped somewhere invisible. They couldn't explain it. They just felt it. That's what she left behind. Not control. Consequence. And yet, even architects of shadow are still human in one unavoidable way. They can feel loneliness. Not the soft, emotional kind. The structural kind. The kind that appears when you realize you are no longer part of the world you shaped. You become a myth even to yourself. She walked through quiet corridors. Clean spaces. Neutral rooms. And felt something she hadn't felt since the basement. Distance. She had no one left to deceive. No one left to guide. No one left to infect. And without targets, a weapon feels weightless. She began to wonder if this was the real punishment. Not prison. Not containment. But irrelevance. But then, it happened. A signal. A quiet disruption in the rhythm of things. She recognized it instantly. Someone else was doing what she had once done. Not copying. Not imitating. Evolving. A new presence in the invisible structure. A mind that saw patterns instead of stories. A man, somewhere above ground, asking the same dangerous questions she once whispered to herself. Who really controls the system? And who is watching them? She felt something old awaken. Not fear. Not jealousy. Recognition. The descent wasn't over. It had just moved on. She didn't chase him. That's the instinct of beginners. She observed. Real predators don't move loudly toward their target. They adjust the environment so the target walks closer on his own. She felt him like a vibration in the structure she had helped build. Small disruptions. Subtle distortions. A curiosity that didn't feel random. He wasn't angry. He wasn't rebellious. He was precise. That made him dangerous. She tracked the way the system responded to him. How digital shadows shifted. How conversations tightened. How Satan doors seemed to open around him without anyone consciously deciding to open them. Men, like him, don't force doors. They make the frame weak first. She saw herself in him, but more refined. More modern. He didn't need a basement. He was born into a world where the walls were already invisible. Where surveillance looked like convenience. Where control looked like choice. He wasn't trapped underground. He was moving freely through a maze that thought it was a city. That's when she understood the real evolution. The girl in the basement was phase 1. She was phase 2. He was phase 3. And phase 3 doesn't get locked away. He was learning without being taught. Seeing patterns the way she once had to be trained to see them. Not through trauma, but through awareness. Not through isolation, but through overload. Too much information forced his brain to compress reality in ways normal men never experience. He didn't want to destroy the system. He wanted to understand it. That's always the first step. She felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Anticipation. Not because she wanted to stop him, because she wanted to meet him, but not face to face. Mentor to student is too obvious. Power prefers masks. So she did what she had always done best. She adjusted the A. Tiny shifts in narrative. A phrase altered here. A silence placed there. A piece of forbidden history appearing in his path at exactly the right moment. He would think he found it himself. He would be right. And wrong. He started waking up faster. Connecting dots. Feeling the hollowness of public structures. Sensing the artificiality of authority. And every step he took toward the truth was a step deeper into her shadow. This wasn't manipulation. This was cultivation. She wasn't creating him. She was sharpening him. And if he survived that sharpening, he wouldn't just replace her. He would surpass her. And for the first time since the basement, she felt something close to satisfaction. Because true architects don't build thrones. They build successes. The descent was no longer hers alone. It had found a new mind to fall through. And this time, it was a man. He started noticing the cracks. That was the first sign he was no longer ordinary. Ordinary men feel discomfort and look away. He leaned closer. He traced the lines. He stared into the seams of the world and asked why they were there. That question alone is enough to exile a man from normal life forever. She watched as he stopped trusting surface stories. News felt staged. Authority sounded hollow. Symbols began to look like cages. He wasn't becoming paranoid. He was becoming calibrated. That's the difference no one teaches you. Paranoia is fear without structure. Awareness is fear with precision. He started to feel the same loneliness she once felt, but he didn't know why. A quiet separation from everyone around him. Laughing in conversations, but not feeling inside them. Walking through crowds like a ghost. That's the side effect of beginning to see the machinery. You can't unsee it, and you can't talk about it without sounding insane. She let him suffer that. That suffering is sacred, because only men who can survive isolation without breaking deserve to see what's behind the next layer. He tried to ignore it, tried to return to normal thinking, normal distractions, normal ambitions. But once the crack opens, normality tastes like plastic. Fake, hollow, dead. His mind kept coming back to patterns, symbols, repetition. Who benefits? Who decides? Who watches? He was becoming dangerous quietly, and she was guiding him without touch. She began to introduce friction into his path. Not obstacles, tests, conflicting information, half-truths, contradictions. Real power never hands you answers. It gives you pressure and watches how your mind adapts. He adapted fast, faster than she expected. That impressed her. He was no longer just an observer. He was evolving. The system began to notice him. Not consciously, not officially, but algorithms shifted. Content moved. Suggestions appeared. Subtle digital hands trying to pull him back toward comfort, toward numbness, toward sleep. He resisted. That was enough. She leaned closer. Not physically, structurally. She whispered through patterns instead of words. Synchronicities. Timing. Doors opening too easily. Dead ends appearing where he wasn't ready. To him, it felt like destiny. To her, it was guidance. And to you, it should feel familiar. Because if you're still here, you already understand more than you admit. The descent doesn't start with a scream. It starts with a quiet suspicion that the world is lying to you. There's a moment in every awakening that feels like falling through your own reflection. He reached it without warning. One day the world still looked real. The next, it felt staged. Not fake in an imaginary way, staged in a designed way. Like a set built so carefully you never question the walls. Until one tiny crack lets light through. He stopped asking what he should believe. He started asking why he believed anything at all. That question is radioactive. She felt it like an electrical shift through the architecture she had once built. Because when a man reaches that question, he can no longer be steered through pride or fear. His brain starts looking for root causes instead of surface emotions. He wasn't mad. He was awake. The system doesn't fear awake men immediately. It tries to recruit them. Soft invitations. Exclusive language. You're different. You see things most people don't. You belong here. They wrap the cage in velvet and call it knowledge. Most men fall for it because it feels like recognition. He didn't. He felt the trap. That's when she understood something rare. He wasn't a pawn. He was a problem. And problems don't get solved. They get studied. She reduced her influence and increased the chaos around him just slightly. Enough to test him. Enough to see if he would fold or refine himself. Men don't grow in comfort. They grow in pressure. And she applied pressure like a sculptor, not a hammer. He grew sharper, quieter, more controlled. He stopped talking about what he was learning. He started storing it. That's when a man becomes truly dangerous. She remembered herself again. The silence, the listening, the way knowledge sits heavier when you don't waste it on people who can't receive it. He was becoming a vault. The system felt him now. Not as a threat, as an anomaly. Data didn't move around him correctly. Predictions failed. Psychological models slipped. Men who had been shaped by her architecture felt uncomfortable around him without knowing why. He wasn't loud. He was misaligned. And misalignment breaks patterns. She knew the next stage. The system wouldn't try to destroy him. It would try to understand him. They would study him without him knowing. Just like they studied her. History doesn't repeat. It tightens. And the descent was tightening around him now. When a system can't predict a man, it does the only thing it knows how to do. It surrounds him with mirrors. Not real mirrors. Social ones. Emotional ones. Situational ones. It tries to make him doubt his own perception by flooding him with normality. Friendly smiles. Comfortable routines. Familiar distractions. Nothing aggressive. Nothing obvious. Just enough noise to blur the signal. He felt it. He stepped through it. That's what separated him. He didn't try to escape the world. That's childish. He learned how to move inside it without being absorbed by it. He wore normality like camouflage. Spoke when expected. Smiled when required. But inside, the lens was always on. The machine was always being observed. She watched him become something she rarely saw. Balanced. Not obsessed. Not paranoid. Calm and dangerous. That combination terrifies systems. Because calm predators don't telegraph movement. They don't shake. They don't rush. They don't expose. He began quietly mapping the unseen power lines. Influence without titles. Authority without visibility. Men who never appeared in headlines but controlled the tone of entire environments. He could feel the same silent corridors she had once sat in. And still, he never reached for control. He reached for truth. That made him unpredictable even to her. She realized she could no longer fully steer him. That made him real. The system began to adjust around him without realizing what it was adjusting to. When a structure bends to accommodate an anomaly, it slowly redefines itself. He wasn't resisting the system. He was teaching it. And without knowing it, he was doing what she had done decades before. Becoming the atmosphere instead of the force. And that's when a terrifying realization surfaced in her mind. He didn't need her. He never did. She was only ever the bridge. The basement wasn't the beginning. She wasn't the origin. She was a chapter. And he was writing a new one. That stung. But not in a bitter way. In a way that felt correct. Because real evolution doesn't preserve its ancestors. It surpasses them. The descent had fully shifted away from her now. She could feel it. Like a current moving under her feet. And yet, there was one final thing she had to give him. Not guidance. Not control. But a warning. About what happens when a man finally sees everything clearly. When the last curtain falls. When the last illusion dies. Because there's a truth darker than control. Darker than manipulation. Darker than architecture. And he was getting close to it. Very close. The warning she gave wasn't spoken. She let it manifest through pattern, timing, and implication. The words themselves weren't necessary. He felt it in the way doors open too easily. in the way men hesitated when they thought he hadn't noticed them, in the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in digital currents. It was as if the world itself leaned in to whisper, "You are crossing lines you cannot retain from." She reminded him without speaking, taught him without teaching. That's how real danger travels. Not as violence, not as spectacle, but as understanding. The knowledge that the architecture you live inside is neither neutral nor forgiving. That every step forward is a negotiation with unseen forces who do not grant permission to live freely. He began noticing patterns she hadn't intentionally exposed. The hidden agreements, the silent hierarchies, the rituals of compliance buried in systems too large to see fully. He wasn't reading like a novice. He was seeing like a man standing behind the glass of a laboratory, watching the machinery of civilization operate. And every realization made him quieter, sharper, calculating, unseen and yet unavoidable. She felt her old pulse return in response. The way the basement had taught her to measure fear, desire, ambition, and loyalty, he was learning it instinctively, faster than she had. That was Ray. That was dangerous. That was perfect. And dangerous, because the system doesn't forgive perfect. It fears it. It cannot digest it. And when it can't digest, it starts to hemorrhage. Quietly, slowly, internally, until collapse comes, not with a bang, but with a soft sigh. She had prepared him only partially. The rest had to emerge from his own choices. That is the way influence truly perpetuates itself. Tools can be taught to act. Minds can only be shown a path and trusted to navigate it. And he was navigating. Every decision a step deeper into shadows the system believed were his own. But she knew better. The basement had taught her to see that the mind always leaves breadcrumbs. And he was leaving them now, unknowingly tracing a map she could read. The descent he had embarked upon was no longer hers. That realization came as both liberation and weight. She felt the thrill of distance, the satisfaction of legacy, but also the cold bite of inevitability. Once a man understands these patterns, once he begins to move inside them consciously, there is no return. The system will recognize him, attempt to absorb him, fail, and then the system will change because of him. Not her, not anyone above or below ground, only him. And this is the real lesson she needed him to understand. Seeing the hidden lines is one thing, crossing them consciously, reshaping them, and surviving the consequences. Only then does a man truly awaken. And he was awakening. The closer he got to the core, the quieter his life became. Not lonelier, quieter. The noise stopped distracting him. The chaos stopped confusing him. The panic that controls most men simply fell away. That's the side effect no one warns you about when you start to see the deeper structure of things. You don't become louder. You don't become dramatic. You become calm in a way that scares people who still live inside illusions. She felt it from far away. Not as fear, as recognition. He had passed the point where men usually tame back, where comfort starts whispering, where friends pull you back into small conversations and small dreams. He didn't turn back. He didn't explain himself. He didn't announce his awareness. He just kept walking. And the more he walked, the more the world seemed to quietly step aside. That's the dangerous part nobody talks about. The system doesn't always fight you. Sometimes it studies you. Sometimes it makes room for you just to observe how you move. The closer a man gets to truth, the less resistance he faces at first. That's not mercy. That's curiosity. A machine doesn't destroy what it doesn't yet understand. It watches it, measures it, waits to see if it's a threat or a tool. She tried to send him a warning, but not with words. Warnings spoken too directly get rejected. He began to feel it instead. A subtle pressure behind choices. A heaviness before certain doors. A kind of invisible tension when certain opportunities appeared too easy. That's how real traps work. Not fear. Comfort. He was learning to feel that difference. And that meant he was ready. Because the most dangerous phase isn't when a man starts questioning the world. It's when the world starts subtly reacting to him. When events feel a little too timed. When conversations feel slightly rehearsed. When coincidence stops feeling random. That's when the descent becomes real. She stepped further back now. Not because she was done, but because this part had to be his. A mentor can't walk this stretch with you. You have to feel it alone. Because the final truth is this: The system doesn't fear strong men. It fears men who no longer need its approval. And he was becoming exactly that. He started noticing the invisible architecture everywhere. Not in textbooks, not in news reports, not in speeches, but in the spaces between words, in the pauses of power, in the tiny choices men make when no one is watching, doors they leave open, emails they don't delete, micro-expressions they assume no one notices, patterns that reveal intentions before words are spoken. She observed him learning this the way she once had, only faster. Decades of her experience condensed into months for him. He wasn't mimicking her. He was improvising, innovating, seeing the rhythm of control, then bending it. That's dangerous, because the system can only account for what is precedent. He was precedent-defying, untrackable. Every decision he made began producing ripples. Small at first. Slight hesitations in meetings. Unnoticed contradictions in reporting chains. Algorithms misfiring, not because of error, but because someone's mind had evolved beyond predictable patterns. That's the invisible terror of real awareness. It doesn't scream. It disrupts silently, and the world can't process it. She felt something she hadn't felt in decades, excitement tempered with caution. Mentors never fear their students until the student surpasses the map. He had passed every test she unconsciously set, and yet, he hadn't reached the point of full understanding. That final layer, the layer most men never see, is the one that separates power from freedom. She knew what awaited him. A moment when the system itself tests you. Not with threats, not with violence, but with subtle illusions so complete that if you misstep, you think reality itself is betraying you. He would have to decide, follow the map, obey the system, survive in its structures, or break free, knowing there is no going back. This is where most men fail. They choose comfort over clarity, predictability over mastery. But he had already shed comfort. He had learned to walk in the cracks, see the seams, hear the invisible whispers, and she realized that the descent she once navigated alone was now shared, in spirit, with someone else. Someone faster, sharper, and more dangerous. And yet, the system didn't yet know. It hadn't recognized the anomaly. That's the beauty of timing. The greatest influencer cares before your adversaries even realize they are observing you. He would move through the next layer unaware he had already changed the rules. And she would watch, knowing that history was quietly bending around him, one imperceptible step at a time. The descent was no longer his. It belonged to him. And he was about to reach the first threshold of true darkness. The first threshold hit him quietly. No alarms. No dramatic confrontation. Just a subtle emptiness in the spaces he had trusted. The systems he believed were stable started to behave unpredictably. Men who once seemed reliable misfired. Machines misaligned. Communications became tangled. He realized something the unawakened never do. That chaos isn't loud. It whispers. It nudges. It rearranges the ground beneath your feet without warning. She watched from a distance, invisible, silent, not guiding, not intervening. He had to step into it himself. That is how men learn the cost of awareness. The basement had taught her that decades ago. Now he would learn it in the world. And the lesson was brutal in its subtlety. Power, when challenged, does not always strike. Sometimes it bends. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it shifts in ways that leave you questioning reality itself. He began noticing patterns that contradicted each other, orders that conflicted, loyalties that fractured. Structures designed to support him started exposing their weaknesses. Men who seemed predictable began acting like wild cards. He wasn't panicked. He was observing, calculating, collecting. Every anomaly fed him clarity. Every contradiction sharpened his awareness. And then he saw the first signs of deliberate misdirection. Not errors, not mistakes. Strategy. A layer of the system designed to test him, to gauge how far his perception had evolved. The system was no longer treating him as a man. It was treating him as an experiment. And every experiment has a cost. She knew he would feel it as a subtle pressure in the mind. A question that loops endlessly. Am I really seeing everything? Or am I being drawn into a design I cannot escape? That is the exact moment the system begins to weigh you. The moment when insight becomes risk. The moment when awareness itself becomes dangerous. Some men break here. They return to comfort. They obey. They bury the question. But he didn't. He leaned into it. Every misalignment, every hidden test, every subtle contradiction became fuel. He started anticipating moves before they were made, recognizing manipulation before it could even reach him. He wasn't just surviving the threshold, he was mastering it. And that mastery, subtle as it seemed, made him dangerous beyond measure, because now he wasn't just observing the architecture. He was beginning to rewrite it, and the system would soon realize it had unleashed something it could neither predict nor control. The deeper he moved into the hidden structures, the more the world itself seemed to conspire around him. Every corridor, every meeting, every whispered instruction became a test. Not of strength, not of endurance, but of awareness. The system was no longer a machine. It had become a living organism, adjusting to his movements, probing for weaknesses, subtly steering him while pretending neutrality. She had prepared him for awareness, but not for the weight of consequence. That is the cruel twist that no one talks about. Knowledge is a double-edged sword. Seeing the patterns, understanding the layers, feeling the invisible hands pulling, all of it sharpens the mind, but it also isolates the man. He began noticing the pauses in conversations, the slight tremors in authority, the micro-adjustments in behavior around him. The system feared him without knowing why. And he felt it. Not panic, not defiance, recognition. That subtle, cold acknowledgement that every move he made was being measured, and every countermove was shaping the invisible currents that controlled millions of lives. He wasn't afraid. He was learning how to navigate the currents without drowning in them. He realized that power is not possession. It is perception. And once a man sees through the facade, the game itself changes. She observed him bending the invisible lines of influence. Every decision, every hesitation, every seemingly minor action began to ripple through the system. Men who once considered themselves untouchable now acted like children. Machinery misfired. Policies stumbled. Algorithms failed. The system, built on control and predictability, could not compute an anomaly so deliberate, so aware. And that was the moment he began to truly walk alone. Because awareness isolates. Precision isolates. Independence isolates. She had walked that path once, in darkness and silence, learning to hear the truth behind every word, every breath, every shadow. He was learning the same. Faster, sharper, cleaner. And he had something she hadn't, the confidence of a mind unburdened by years of confinement, unscarred by fear, uncorrupted by the slow rot of institutional compromise. He was evolving beyond the template she had once embodied. And as she watched, a dangerous thought settled in her mind. The apprentice had outgrown the mentor. The descent she had begun in shadows was no longer her story. It belonged to him now. And the system would soon have to reckon with it. Not gently, not subtly, but in a way that could change everything it thought it controlled. He reached a point where every interaction felt like a test, even the ones that seemed trivial. A conversation in a hallway, a misdirected email, a fleeting glance across a crowded room. The system tried to predict him, to contain him, to steer him toward outcomes it could tolerate. And yet, with every subtle attempt, he bent reality slightly, imperceptibly, until the invisible walls of control no longer aligned. She watched as he internalized the rhythm of power. Not the loud, performative kind. The quiet, structural kind that shapes decisions before they are even made. It isn't in speeches. It isn't in memos. It's in the pauses, the tone, the choice of what to leave unsaid. And he was learning to move inside it like water, filling gaps the architects had ignored, slipping past barriers they didn't even know existed. The system grew restless. Algorithms, models, hierarchies, all adjusted themselves subtly to account for him, and all failed. They couldn't predict a mind that no longer needed the rules to operate. Men who once believed they were untouchable felt unease they could not explain. The invisible currents of influence she had once created now responded to him as though he were the source. And in that, he became dangerous, not by force, but by presence. She realized then something terrifying and exhilarating. She had trained him without touching him. The apprentice didn't need instruction anymore. He was self-guided, self-aware, self-directed. And that's the ultimate danger to any system. Systems fear tools that no longer require the operator, forces that no longer need permission. He could destroy the architecture without touching a single brick. She remembered the basement, the experiments, the quiet surveillance, the tests of insight and endurance. He hadn't needed any of that. He had been born into a world of excess information, of subtle manipulations everywhere, and he had learned faster than she had dreamed possible. The system's traps became lessons. The pressures became training. The contradictions became maps. And with each passing day, he inched closer to the final layer, the layer she had never dared to reveal to anyone, the layer where truth is no longer something you see. It is something you become. It is the point where perception becomes reality, where control ceases to exist, and where the man who can navigate it becomes untouchable. The descent was nearly complete, and when he reached the bottom, he would understand what she had known all along, that the darkest truths are not hidden in basements, documents, or secrets. They live inside the mind, and once you see them, you cannot unsee them. He began to operate differently, not with aggression, not with force, with inevitability. Every action, every decision, every movement felt preordained, not because it was planned, but because he had internalized the rules of the hidden world so completely that he could bend them without effort. The system started reacting to him before he moved, adjusting, compensating, trying to maintain balance, failing in silence. She watched it all unfold like a silent symphony. This is the moment she had waited for decades to witness, the apprentice surpassing the mentor. The system that once controlled her now trembled before a mind it could not predict. And the beauty of it wasn't chaos. It was structure, unseen, undeniable, unstoppable. A quiet authority that demanded recognition without demanding attention. He started noticing patterns that even she hadn't fully mapped. Hidden agendas layered within agendas. Psychological manipulations folded into bureaucracies. Men who considered themselves untouchable, unknowable, suddenly predictable. Not because he studied them, but because he felt them. He instinctively knew the weights, the pressures, the invisible levers of influence, and he touched them lightly, and the machine shifted. She saw him step into the ultimate danger, awareness without fear. That is the threshold few men survive. Knowledge without hesitation, insight without doubt, the ability to see the system's bones and choose either to mend them or to break them. Most men become paralyzed at this point, caught between ambition and terror. He moved forward, calm, deliberate, unstoppable. The system sensed him now as a variable it could neither absorb nor eliminate. Subtle recalibrations rippled through networks, hierarchies, and hidden chains of command. Men who once believed themselves untouchable felt unease like a disease crawling through their bones. It wasn't visible. It wasn't measurable. But it was undeniable. He was rewriting influence at a level no one yet understood. She realized then that this moment was far bigger than herself. The descent she had endured in darkness, in isolation, in hidden corridors and cold concrete, had created a legacy, not of obedience, not of control, but of evolution. The basement, the silence, the observation, the manipulation, it had produced a spark. And now, that spark had become a blaze. The apprentice was no longer learning. He was becoming a force. And the system, built on fear, obedience, and predictability, had no defense left. This is the point where the story stops being about hidden agendas and starts being about raw, uncontainable power. The world around him had not changed, at least, not visibly. Streets, offices, digital networks, institutions, all appeared normal. That's how power hides its own collapse. It doesn't roar. It simulates stability while cracking from within. He understood this instinctively. Every conversation, every email, every public gesture was a layer of performance concealing a deeper truth. The machinery of control no longer knew where to place him. She watched as subtle failures began appearing. Men who once believed themselves untouchable hesitated. Decisions that should have flowed seamlessly now clogged with friction. Algorithms, financial systems, communication channels, all were being nudged, adjusted, disrupted, without anyone realizing the origin. And he remained calm, observing, calculating, using the disturbances as a map rather than a threat. That's the most dangerous kind of man, the one who treats chaos as guidance. He wasn't pushing against the system. He was letting the system reveal itself. Every flaw, every crack, every concealed agenda unfolded before him like a blueprint. He didn't need to fight it. He didn't need to manipulate it. He simply saw it. And seeing alone is power the system cannot comprehend. She realized then something she had never fully admitted to herself. She had not created him. She had only prepared the space for him to exist. The basement, the silence, the training, the observation, all of it mattered less than the spark he carried. And the spark didn't just illuminate, it consumed. It revealed the fragility of everything built on fear, obedience, and secrecy. He moved through invisible corridors of influence, identifying weak links, noting contradictions, feeling pressures the architects thought they had hidden. The subtlety of his progress made him untouchable. Men continued to believe they were still in control, that nothing had shifted. And that's when he became most dangerous, not when he acted, but when he waited. She felt a rare emotion then, awe. The apprentice had not only learned the lessons she thought only she could teach, he had improved them, refined them, expanded them. The system she had survived, manipulated, and ultimately transcended was now facing a force it could neither predict nor comprehend. The descent she had endured for decades had reached its culmination. He was no longer a student. He was the shadow the system feared but could not locate. And when he decided to move, no one, not her, not the architects, not the men who believed themselves untouchable, would be able to stop him. The final layer of darkness was about to awaken. He began to step into the spaces where power breathed invisibly. Boardrooms, digital networks, quiet meetings where decisions were whispered instead of announced. Invisible levers that controlled thousands, even millions, were now visible to him. Not because anyone had told him, not because anyone had shown him. He saw them because he had evolved to perceive them, and perception, in its purest form, is power. She watched from the shadows, her pulse quiet but keen. This was the culmination of everything she had learned, endured, and survived. The basement, the isolation, the manipulation, the long, silent years of observing systems from within. All of it had prepared the world, and now this man, for a reckoning it could not anticipate. The system itself began to falter, though no one could name why. Men who had once ruled confidently hesitated. Hierarchies trembled. The invisible chains that had kept millions in place shifted without any apparent touch. All because he moved differently. Not faster, not louder. Smarter. Subtly. With the precision of someone who sees everything and fears nothing. She felt the tension ripple through her memory, decades compressed into observation. The apprentice had become her mirror, her successor, her reckoning. And for the first time, she realized something she had never fully admitted. She had never truly been the apex of her own design. That apex was not a person. It was awareness. And now, a new mind had reached it. Every action he took created feedback loops the architects could neither predict nor understand. They were dancing to a rhythm they could not hear. Men who believed themselves untouchable grew anxious without knowing why. The system's control had become visible only to those who had earned the sight. And he had. She sensed the moment approaching. The point where observation ends and influence begins. Where seeing is no longer enough. Where the world itself starts responding to the unseen hand, bending, breaking, adapting. He had already changed the rules without a word. And when he chose to act, the world would realign itself in response. The descent had reached its apex. No basements. No shadows. No hidden rooms. Just one man who understood the machinery of power completely. And the terrifying truth, what comes next cannot be contained, controlled, or reversed. The darkness is no longer hidden. It is awake. It is moving. And it has a mind of its own. He paused for a moment, not because he hesitated, but because he understood the weight of what lay ahead. The system had become conscious of him, and that consciousness was fragile, reactive, desperate. Every misstep could trigger collapse, yet he moved deliberately, as if the world itself were clay and he held the tool to shape it. That is the final lesson she had never been able to fully teach. Power doesn't belong to the loudest, the cruelest, or the most visible. It belongs to the aware. She remembered herself in the basement. The silence, the recordings, the observations, the understanding of every human flaw as if they were open books. That girl had survived, adapted, and evolved. But he had surpassed her. He carried not just her knowledge, but her intuition refined, amplified, and weaponized. And she realized that in this moment, the apprentice had become something far more dangerous than a student. He was a force the system could no longer ignore. The architects of control, men who once thought themselves untouchable, now flinched in meetings, hesitated in decisions, and wondered why their predictions failed. Algorithms shifted inexplicably. Policies stumbled. Communication channels faltered. Every attempt to stabilize the machine only revealed more cracks. And he remained calm, observing, adjusting, letting the world strain under its own illusion of order. She saw the truth now, the lesson she had waited decades to witness. The system never fears those it can see. It fears those it cannot measure. And he had become unmeasurable. Every step he took was deliberate, but invisible. Every influence he exerted went uncredited. The world itself bent without realizing it. And the men who thought they built it realized too late that it had begun to belong to someone else. This was the apex of the descent. Not chaos, not destruction, not domination, but understanding so complete, so profound, that the world cannot pretend to contain it. And she, watching from the shadows, understood what few ever do. The girl in the basement had been only the beginning. The apprentice, the one now walking unseen through the hidden corridors of influence, was the continuation and the transformation. The system will try to respond. It always does. But it is too late. He moves in ways it cannot anticipate. He sees the structures it cannot show. He knows the motives it cannot hide. And he will act, because awareness is a weapon. And now, the darkness is no longer silent. It is alive. It is free. It is unstoppable. The descent ends here. But for him, the ascent has only begun.